It was Christmas Eve and I was helping my mom wrap presents in the living room. The tree was all lit up, and Christmas music was playing softly in the background. I was so excited about Santa coming that night, I could barely sit still. Mom kept telling me to focus on the wrapping, but I was just too pumped up. We'd been at it for a while and I was getting pretty good at folding the corners just right. Mom was teaching me how to make the ribbon curl with scissors. I thought I was being so grown up helping out like that. The living room floor was covered in scraps of wrapping paper, and the air smelled like pine and cinnamon. I reached into the big shopping bag to grab more tape, and that's when it happened. My hand brushed against something that moved. At first I thought it was just the tissue paper shifting, but then I felt it again. It was definitely moving. I froze for a second, my hand still in the bag. Then curiosity got the better of me and I slowly pulled my hand out. There, sitting on my palm, was the biggest spider I'd ever seen. It was dark and hairy, with long legs that stretched out across my entire hand. For a split second I just stared at it, not quite believing what I was seeing. Then it twitched and I lost it. I screamed and shook my hand frantically, trying to get the spider off. But instead of falling to the floor, it started crawling up my arm. I could feel each of its 8 legs moving against my skin, and it was heading straight for my face. I jumped up, still screaming, and started swatting at my arm with my other hand. In my panic, I didn't realize how close I was to the Christmas tree. As I spun around trying to shake off the spider, my elbow caught one of the branches. The whole tree started to wobble. I reached out to try and steady it, but that just made things worse. The tree tipped over, and I went down with it. I landed hard on the floor, tangled up in a mess of tree branches, lights, and tinsel. Ornaments were shattering all around me, and I could hear the crunch of broken glass under my body. The lights were still on, blinking and flashing in my face. I was completely disoriented, and worst of all, I had no idea where the spider was. I thrashed around, trying to free myself from the tangle of wires and branches. Every time I moved, something else would break or fall. The tinsel was wrapped around my legs, and the more I struggled, the tighter it seemed to get. I could feel sharp pokes from the tree needles and the occasional sting of a glass shard cutting into my skin. The whole time, I was convinced the spider was still on me somewhere. Every little touch or movement sent me into a fresh panic. I was crying and yelling, begging for help. The Christmas music was still playing in the background, creating this surreal contrast to the chaos I was in. I heard my parents running down the stairs. Mom was calling my name, asking what was wrong. When they got to the living room, they must have been shocked by what they saw. The beautiful tree we'd spent hours decorating was now a wreck on the floor, with me right in the middle of it. Dad started trying to untangle me from the mess. Every time he touched me, I'd jerk away, thinking it was the spider. I was sobbing so hard I could barely breathe, trying to explain about the spider between gasps. Mom was picking through the debris, looking for it, but also trying to avoid the broken ornaments scattered everywhere. As they worked to free me, I kept feeling little tickles on my skin. Each one made me jump and cry out. I was sure it was the spider, but most of the time it was just a piece of tinsel or a pine needle. The fear and adrenaline had me so worked up that everything felt like a threat. Finally, they managed to pull me out of the wreckage. I was a mess, covered in sap. Tinsel stuck to my clothes and hair, and little cuts all over my arms and legs from the broken ornaments. I was shaking uncontrollably, still convinced the spider was on me somewhere. Mom held me close, trying to calm me down while Dad searched through the fallen tree and decorations. He was moving branches and looking under scattered presents, but there was no sign of the spider. I couldn't stop shaking, and every few seconds I'd start brushing myself off frantically, sure I'd felt it moving on me again. The living room was a disaster, broken ornaments everywhere, water from the tree stand soaking into the carpet, and tangled strings of lights blinking sadly among the mess. Half-wrapped presents were crushed under the tree, and bits of glass glittered all over the floor. As the initial shock started to wear off, the cuts and bruises from my fall began to sting. Mom took me to the bathroom to clean me up, but I was too scared to be alone. I made her check my hair and clothes over and over, certain the spider was hiding somewhere on me. Every time she touched a tangle in my hair or tried to pick off a piece of tinsel, I'd flinch and start to panic again. Back in the living room, Dad was still searching for the spider. He'd moved the tree and was going through the branches methodically. I watched from the doorway, unable to look away but terrified he might actually find it. The anticipation was almost worse than seeing the spider in the first place. They tried to get me to go to bed, saying Santa wouldn't come if I was still awake, but I was too scared to be alone in my room. I was sure the spider would somehow find its way upstairs. We ended up all sleeping in the living room that night. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. I was 12 years old, and it was 2 days before Christmas. My mom and I were at the mall doing some last-minute shopping. It was packed, way more crowded than I'd ever seen it before. People were everywhere, rushing around with bags and boxes, all trying to get their shopping done. We'd been there for a couple of hours already, and I was getting pretty tired. My mom wanted to check out this kitchenware store for a gift for my aunt, but I thought it was boring. I asked if I could go look at the video game store nearby while she shopped. She said okay, but made me promise to meet her back at the kitchenware store in 15 minutes. I headed off to the game store, excited to see what new releases they had. The store was crowded too, full of kids and parents looking at games. I spent some time checking out the different games, imagining which ones I might get for Christmas. Before I knew it, more than 15 minutes had passed. I left the store and started walking back to where I was supposed to meet my mom. That's when I realized I couldn't remember which store it was. All the shops started to look the same, and there were so many people around that I couldn't see very far ahead of me. I started to worry a little, but I figured I'd find her soon enough. I walked up and down that section of the mall, looking in each store, but I couldn't see my mom anywhere. The crowd seemed to get thicker, and I felt like I was being pushed around by all the shoppers rushing past me. As time went on, I started to panic. The mall suddenly seemed huge, and I felt so small in the middle of all those people. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel tears starting to form in my eyes. I kept looking around, hoping to see my mom's familiar face in the crowd, but there was nothing. I decided I needed help. I remembered my mom telling me that if I ever got lost, I should find a security guard. I started looking around for someone in a uniform. It took a while, but finally I spotted a man wearing what looked like a security guard outfit near one of the mall exits. I pushed my way through the crowd to get to him. When I reached him, I was out of breath and on the verge of tears. I told him I was lost and couldn't find my mom. He looked down at me, and something about his expression made me uneasy. His eyes were cold, and he didn't smile like I thought a security guard would when helping a kid. He told me to follow him, that he knew where the lost and found area was and my mom would probably be waiting there. I hesitated for a moment. Something didn't feel right, but I was scared and didn't know what else to do. So I followed him. We started walking, and I noticed we were moving away from the main area of the mall. The crowds were thinning out, and the noise was getting less. I started to get a weird feeling in my stomach. This didn't seem like the way to a lost and found area. I asked the guard where we were going, and he just said it was a little further. We turned down a hallway I'd never seen before. There were no shops here, just plain walls and some doors that looked like they led to offices or storage rooms. The lights were dimmer, and I could barely hear the sounds of the mall anymore. That's when I knew something was very wrong. This wasn't where a lost kid should be taken. I stopped walking and told the guard I wanted to go back to the main area. He turned around, and the look on his face scared me more than anything ever had before. His eyes were wide, and he had this creepy smile. He reached out to grab my arm. In that moment, pure fear took over. I turned and ran as fast as I could. I could hear his footsteps behind me, and he was yelling for me to stop. But there was no way I was going to stop. I ran back towards the noise and lights of the main mall area. As I burst out of the hallway, I started screaming for help. I was crying and yelling, "Help me! He's not a real security guard." People started turning to look, but most just seemed confused. I kept running, pushing through the crowd, trying to get as far away as possible. I glanced back and saw the fake guard had stopped at the entrance to the hallway. He looked angry and scared at the same time. Then he turned and disappeared back down the hallway. I was still running and screaming when I crashed into someone. It was the owner of a candy store I'd visited earlier with my mom. He grabbed my shoulders to steady me and asked what was wrong. Between sobs, I tried to explain about the fake security guard and how he'd tried to take me somewhere. The store owner immediately called for a real security guard. Within minutes, there were actual mall security personnel around us. They asked me to describe the man, and I told them everything I could remember about how he looked and what he was wearing. While this was happening, I heard a familiar voice calling my name. It was my mom. She pushed through the crowd, looking frantic. When she saw me, she ran over and hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She'd been searching everywhere for me, getting more and more worried as time passed. The real security guards explained to my mom what had happened. They said they would review the security cameras and search for the man. They also called the police to report the incident. My mom and I left the mall immediately after that. The ride home was quiet. I was still shaking, and my mom kept reaching over to touch my arm, like she needed to make sure I was really there. It was Christmas morning and I was 12 years old. I'd been lying in bed for what felt like hours, too excited to sleep. The house was quiet, and I knew my parents and little sister were still asleep. I couldn't wait any longer to see what Santa had brought. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make any noise. The floor was cold under my feet as I crept to the door. I opened it slowly, wincing at the tiny creak it made. The hallway was dark, but I could see a faint glow coming from downstairs. My heart raced with excitement as I imagined the presents waiting for me. As I reached the top of the stairs, I paused. I knew which steps creaked and which were safe. I'd mapped them out weeks ago, planning for this very moment. I took a deep breath and started my careful descent. Step by step, I made my way down, avoiding the third step that always groaned under any weight. Halfway down, I froze. I thought I heard something from the living room. A rustle maybe, or a soft thud. I held my breath, straining to listen. After a few seconds of silence, I convinced myself it was just the house settling or maybe the cat moving around. I continued down, even more cautiously now. As I neared the bottom, I could see more of the living room. The Christmas tree lights were on, casting a soft, colorful glow across the room. Shadows danced on the walls, created by the twinkling lights. I smiled, thinking how magical it all looked. That's when I saw it. A figure standing by the tree. My heart leaped with excitement. Santa. He was real, and I was about to see him. I almost called out, but stopped myself just in time. I didn't want to scare him away. I took the last few steps as quietly as I could, my eyes fixed on the figure. As I got closer, something felt off. The shape wasn't quite right. It was too tall, too thin to be the jolly Santa I'd imagined. But who else could it be? I stepped into the living room, and that's when the figure turned. In that instant, I knew this wasn't Santa. This wasn't anyone who should be in our house. The man was dressed all in black with a ski mask covering his face. Only his eyes were visible, and they widened in surprise when they saw me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This man, this stranger, was standing in my living room on Christmas morning, a sack in one hand and something shiny. A knife in the other. Before I could react, he moved. He was so fast. 1 second he was by the tree, the next he was right in front of me. His hand clamped over my mouth, muffling the scream I didn't even realize I was about to let out. The other hand, the one with the knife, pressed against my side. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice rough and threatening. I could smell something sour on his breath. "If you scream, if you make any noise at all, I'll hurt you. Understand?" I nodded, tears already forming in my eyes. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a nightmare. But the hand on my mouth felt too real, the knife against my side too cold and sharp. He dragged me further into the living room, away from the stairs. My mind was racing. What was he going to do? Where were my parents? Would they wake up? Should I try to scream anyway? The man kept looking around nervously like he was trying to decide what to do next. I could feel his hand shaking slightly against my mouth. Was he as scared as I was? "Okay, kid," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna sit down right here, and you're not gonna move. You're not gonna make a sound. If you do what I say, you won't get hurt. Got it?" I nodded again, not seeing any other choice. He slowly removed his hand from my mouth but kept the knife close. I sank to the floor, my legs feeling weak and shaky. The carpet felt rough against my bare legs, and I suddenly realized how cold I was in just my pajamas. The man started moving around the room quickly, shoving things into his sack. I watched as he grabbed the presents from under the tree, the ones I had been so excited to open just minutes ago. He unplugged the TV and started wrapping the cord around it. I sat there, trying to control my breathing, trying not to make a sound. My eyes darted to the stairs, willing my parents to wake up, to come down and save me. But the house remained silent except for the rustling sounds of the burglar. As he moved around, I noticed things about him. He was tall but skinny. His clothes looked dirty and worn. He kept muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out the words. Every few seconds he'd glance at me, making sure I was still there, still quiet. I don't know how long this went on. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. My legs were starting to cramp from sitting so still. I shifted slightly, and a floorboard creaked under me. The man whirled around, the knife pointing at me. "I said don't move," he hissed. I froze, terrified I'd made a fatal mistake. But then something else happened. A sound came from upstairs. A door opening. The burglar's eyes widened in panic. He looked at me, then at the stairs, then back at me. I could see him trying to decide what to do. In that moment of his distraction, I saw my chance. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not to the stairs, but to the front door. I heard the man curse behind me, heard his footsteps as he chased after me. My hand found the doorknob, turned it, yanked the door open. The cold air hit me like a slap as I burst outside. I screamed as loud as I could, "Help! Burglar! Help!" I ran down the front path, my bare feet slipping on the frosty grass. I could hear commotion from the house behind me, my parents shouting, doors slamming. I ran to the neighbor's house, pounding on their door, still screaming. Lights were coming on in houses up and down the street. I heard a car engine roar to life and saw our car speeding away, the burglar making his escape. My neighbors came out, wrapped me in a blanket. My parents ran over, hugging me, asking if I was okay. In the distance, I could hear sirens approaching. The whole neighborhood was awake now, people coming out of their houses asking what happened. I was 9 years old and it was Christmas Eve. Our house was all decked out for the holidays. Tinsel on the tree, stockings hung by the fireplace, and that pine fresh smell from the real Christmas tree we'd picked out a week earlier. I'd spent the whole afternoon helping my mom bake cookies for Santa. We made his favorite, at least I was sure they were his favorite, chocolate chip with extra chips. As bedtime got closer, I started pestering my parents about leaving out the cookies and milk for Santa. They seemed a bit tired of my constant chatter about it, but I was too excited to notice. Finally, my dad said we could set everything up before I went to bed. I carefully arranged the cookies on a special Christmas plate, the one with reindeers around the edge that we only used once a year. I made sure to pick out the biggest, most perfect cookies from the batch. Then I poured a tall glass of milk, making sure it wasn't too full in case Santa had shaky hands from all the cold weather at the North Pole. We put everything on the coffee table right next to the Christmas tree. I thought it was the perfect spot. Santa wouldn't be able to miss it when he came down the chimney. I even left a little note thanking him for all his hard work, just to make sure he knew how much I appreciated him. My parents finally managed to get me into bed, but I was way too excited to sleep. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, imagining Santa's sleigh landing on our roof. Every little creak or sound made me think he might already be here. I don't know how long I was awake, but eventually I must have dozed off. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a weird scratching sound coming from downstairs. My first thought was that it must be Santa. He was here eating the cookies I'd left out. I had to see him. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding with excitement. The floor was cold under my bare feet as I tiptoed to the door. I opened it as slowly and quietly as I could, wincing at every tiny creak. The hallway was dark, but I could see a faint glow coming from downstairs, probably from the Christmas tree lights we'd left on for Santa. As I crept down the hallway to the stairs, the scratching sound got louder. It didn't sound quite like I imagined Santa eating cookies would sound. It was more frantic. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, suddenly feeling a little unsure. But my curiosity won out over my growing unease. I started down the stairs, carefully avoiding the steps I knew would creak. The scratching sound was definitely coming from the living room. As I got closer, I could hear other noises too, a sort of rustling and... was that splashing? I reached the bottom of the stairs and peered around the corner into the living room. The Christmas tree lights cast a soft, colorful glow over everything. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then my eyes landed on the coffee table where we'd left Santa's cookies and milk. What I saw made me freeze in place. There, on the table, was the biggest rat I'd ever seen. It was huge, easily the size of a small cat. Its fur was a dirty brown, and its long, naked tail curled around the plate of cookies. The rat was stuffing cookies into its mouth with its little hands, crumbs flying everywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. The glass of milk had been knocked over and the rat was splashing around in the puddle, its fur wet and matted. The Christmas plate was chipped where it had been knocked against the glass. I stood there, unable to move, unable to believe what I was seeing. This wasn't Santa. This was a monster, destroying the careful preparations I'd made. As I watched, horrified, the rat grabbed another cookie and shoved it into its already full mouth. That's when it happened. The rat, in the middle of its feasting, suddenly stopped and looked up. Its beady black eyes locked onto mine. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a second or two. Then, without warning, it dropped the cookie and started running, straight towards me. I'd like to say I did something brave or smart, but the truth is, I completely panicked. I let out the loudest scream I've ever made in my life. It was a scream of pure terror, the kind that comes from deep in your gut when you're more scared than you've ever been before. The rat, startled by my scream, changed course. It leaped off the coffee table and scurried under the couch, but I was too frightened to notice or care where it had gone. I turned and ran back up the stairs, still screaming at the top of my lungs. My screams woke up the entire house. I heard doors slamming open, my parents calling out, my little sister starting to cry. Lights flicked on all over the house. I ran straight into my parents' room, babbling incoherently about the rat and Santa and the cookies. My dad, looking sleepy and confused, tried to calm me down while my mom went to check on my sister. But I was hysterical, crying and hiccuping, trying to explain what I'd seen. It took several minutes before they could understand what I was saying. When I finally managed to tell them about the rat, my dad's face changed. He went from looking confused to alert in an instant. He told me and my mom to stay upstairs while he went to check it out. I clung to my mom, terrified that the rat might have followed me up the stairs. We could hear my dad moving around downstairs, calling up every now and then to ask questions or give updates. He found the mess on the coffee table, the spilled milk, the scattered and chewed up cookies, the chipped plate. But there was no sign of the rat. After what seemed like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes, my dad came back upstairs. He said he couldn't find any rat, but he had seen some droppings behind the couch. He set up a few traps just in case and said we'd deal with it more in the morning. My parents tried to get me to go back to bed, but I was too scared. Every little sound made me jump, convinced the rat was coming back. In the end, they let me sleep in their room for the rest of the night. As I lay there in the dark, wide awake despite my exhaustion, all I could think about was the rat. Its beady eyes, its sharp teeth, the way it had run straight at me. I knew I'd never be able to look at our living room the same way again. And as for leaving out cookies for Santa, well, that tradition was definitely over for me. Our house was packed for the annual Christmas party. I was 11, and the noise of adults laughing and Christmas music was everywhere. The Christmas tree lights blinked in the corner, and the smell of Mom's famous apple pie filled the air. I was trying to squeeze through the crowd, dodging elbows and plates of food, when I heard my mom's voice over the noise. She was asking if anyone had seen more chairs. We always needed more chairs for this party. Every year it seemed like more people showed up. I knew we had some folding chairs in the basement, so I decided to go get them. It would be a chance to escape the noise for a bit too. I made my way to the basement door, slipping past my uncle who was telling the same joke he told every year. The door creaked as I opened it, but nobody noticed over the sound of Jingle Bell Rock playing on the stereo. The stairs were dark, and I felt along the wall for the light switch. The yellow bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows down the stairs. It was cooler down here, and the sounds of the party became muffled. I could still hear the bass of the music thumping through the ceiling. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something odd. The storage room door was open just a crack, and there was a light on inside. I thought maybe my dad had been down here earlier looking for something. He was always forgetting where he put stuff. I pushed the door open, ready to grab the chairs and head back upstairs. That's when I saw him. Our neighbor was standing there, his back to me. At first I was just confused. What was he doing down here? He was supposed to be upstairs at the party. Then I noticed what he was holding. It was my mom's jewelry box. I must have made a noise because he suddenly turned around. His eyes went wide when he saw me, and the friendly smile I was used to seeing was gone. Instead, his face looked scary. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before, and it made my stomach feel weird. For a second, we just stared at each other. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask what he was doing, but before I could, he moved. He was so fast. One moment he was across the room, the next he was right in front of me. His hand clamped over my mouth, muffling the scream I didn't even realize I was about to let out. His other arm wrapped around me, lifting me off the ground. I kicked and tried to squirm away, but he was so much stronger than me. I could smell the beer on his breath as he leaned in close to my ear. He told me to be quiet, that if I made a sound, he'd hurt me. I had never been so scared in my life. This was someone I knew, someone I thought was nice. He had helped me build a birdhouse last summer. Now he was terrifying me. He dragged me across the room toward the closet. My feet barely touched the ground, and I couldn't get any leverage to break free. The whole time he kept his hand pressed tight over my mouth. I could hardly breathe. He yanked open the closet door and shoved me inside. It was dark and smelled like old cardboard and mothballs. I stumbled over something on the floor, probably one of my dad's old bowling balls, and fell against the back wall. Before I could turn around, the door slammed shut. I heard the click of the lock. I stood there in the dark, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could hear him moving around in the storage room, the sound of drawers opening and closing, things being moved around. What was he doing? What was he going to do to me? I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear what was happening. The music from upstairs was just a faint thump, thump, thump down here. I heard the neighbor curse under his breath, then the sound of the jewelry box snapping shut. My mind was racing. Should I yell for help? Would anyone even hear me up there with the music and all the talking? What if he heard me and came back? What would he do then? I decided to wait. Maybe he would leave, and I could try to get out somehow. Maybe someone would notice I was missing and come looking for me. I tried to control my breathing, which sounded so loud in the small space. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't tell if I'd been in there for minutes or hours. My legs started to ache from standing still, trying not to make any noise. I slowly sank to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest. Every little sound made me jump. The house creaking, the heater kicking on. Even my own breathing all seemed amplified in the dark closet. I kept imagining the door opening, the neighbor standing there, ready to... I didn't even know what. I just knew it would be bad. I thought about my parents upstairs. Were they looking for me yet? Did they even notice I was gone? There were so many people at the party, maybe they just thought I was playing with my cousins or something. As I sat there, I started to feel around the closet, hoping to find something I could use. Maybe there was another way out, or something I could use to defend myself if he came back. My hands touched old coats, boxes, and what felt like my dad's golf clubs. Nothing useful. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark. It felt like hours. My back was starting to hurt from leaning against the wall and my mouth was dry. I was getting thirsty and I really needed to use the bathroom, but I was too scared to make a sound. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps on the basement stairs. Was it the neighbor coming back or was someone coming to find me? I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps got closer. I could hear someone moving around in the storage room. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I pressed myself into the corner of the closet, trying to make myself as small as possible. Then I heard a voice. It was my dad. He was calling my name. For a second, I was too shocked to respond. Then I started yelling and banging on the door. "I'm in here, I'm locked in the closet." I heard my dad's surprised voice, then the sound of him trying the door. "Hold on," he called. "I'll get you out." There was some rattling, then a loud crack as he forced the door open. Light flooded in, blinding me for a moment. Then I saw my dad's face, a mix of concern and confusion. I practically fell out of the closet, wrapping my arms around him. I was crying now, all the fear and tension releasing at once. My dad hugged me back, asking what happened, how I got locked in there. Through my tears, I tried to explain about the neighbor, about seeing him with Mom's jewelry box. My dad's face changed as I talked. He looked angry now. He picked me up even though I was really too big for that now and carried me upstairs. The party was still going on, but it all seemed muted somehow. I saw my mom's face, worried and confused, as we came up from the basement. I heard my dad telling someone to call the police. People were asking questions, their voices all jumbling together. I was still clinging to my dad, my face buried in his shoulder. I didn't want to look at anyone. I just wanted it all to be over. The last thing I remember clearly is sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, while a police officer asked me questions. The party had broken up, and the house felt strangely empty and quiet. I could see my parents talking to other officers, their faces serious and angry. I was exhausted, drained from the fear and adrenaline. As I sat there, answering questions and trying not to cry again, all I could think about was how different everything felt now. I was 7 years old when it happened. We were visiting my grandparents for Christmas Eve like we did every year. Their house was this big old place in the countryside, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows. But the best part was the huge brick fireplace in the living room. It was a real fireplace, not like the electric one we had at home. The drive to their house always felt so long. I kept asking my parents if we were there yet, bouncing in my seat with excitement. When we finally pulled up to the house, I could see the warm glow of lights through the windows. The old oak tree in the front yard was covered in a thin layer of snow, its branches reaching out like skeleton fingers against the dark sky. As soon as we got inside, the warm air hit me. It smelled like cinnamon and pine needles. My grandma had been baking all day and the whole house smelled amazing. But what really caught my eye was the fireplace. A fire was already crackling away, casting dancing shadows across the room. The Christmas tree stood next to it, all lit up and covered in ornaments. I couldn't stop staring at the fireplace. In my mind, that's where Santa would come from. I'd never seen a real chimney before, and I was sure this was exactly the kind Santa used. I kept picturing him sliding down it, his red suit maybe getting a little sooty but still magical. While the adults were talking and setting up for dinner, I snuck closer to the fireplace. The heat from the fire made my cheeks feel hot, and I could hear the wood popping and crackling. I looked up the chimney, trying to see the sky, but it was too dark. I wondered how Santa could fit down something so narrow. As the evening went on, I got more and more excited. We had dinner and I barely tasted the food. All I could think about was Santa coming down that chimney. My parents kept telling me to slow down, to chew my food, but I was in a rush. The sooner dinner was over, the sooner it would be time for Santa to come. After dinner, we all gathered in the living room. The adults were drinking something that smelled sharp and strong, laughing and talking about boring grown-up things. I sat as close to the fireplace as I was allowed, my eyes glued to the chimney opening. Every now and then a gust of wind would make the fire flicker, and I'd hold my breath thinking it might be Santa. As it got later, my eyelids started to feel heavy. I fought to stay awake, determined to see Santa. My mom tried to get me to go to bed, but I begged to stay up just a little longer. I was sure that if I just waited a bit more, I'd see him. That's when I heard it. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound coming from up the chimney. I sat up straight, suddenly wide awake. This was it. It had to be Santa. The scratching got louder and I could hear something moving in the chimney. I was so excited I could barely breathe. I opened my mouth to tell everyone that Santa was coming, but before I could say anything, something fell out of the fireplace. It wasn't Santa. It wasn't even close. A big dark shape tumbled out of the chimney, right into the fire. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. Then the shape moved, and in the firelight, I saw what it was, a raccoon. A very angry, very scared raccoon. The raccoon let out this horrible screeching noise and jumped out of the fire. Its fur was smoking and it looked wild-eyed and terrified. That's when everything went crazy. My grandma screamed. My dad jumped up, knocking over his chair. The raccoon, panicked and probably in pain, started running around the room like it was possessed. It was so fast, just a blur of smoky fur and glinting eyes. I was frozen in place, watching in horror as this animal that had fallen from where Santa was supposed to be tore around the room. It knocked over the Christmas tree, ornaments shattering as they hit the floor. Presents went flying. The raccoon ran up the curtains, shredding them as it climbed. The adults were yelling and trying to catch it, but that just seemed to make the raccoon more frantic. It jumped from the curtains onto the bookshelf, sending books tumbling to the floor. Then it leaped onto the dinner table, still set with the fancy plates and glasses my grandma only used for Christmas. I watched in shock as plates crashed to the floor, food went flying, and the tablecloth was pulled off, taking everything with it. My mom was trying to get me out of the room, but I couldn't move. I was terrified, but I couldn't look away. The raccoon was making these awful high-pitched noises, a mix of growling and screaming. It didn't sound anything like the cute raccoons I'd seen in cartoons. This was a wild animal, scared out of its mind. My dad and grandpa were trying to corner it, armed with brooms and cushions, but the raccoon was too quick. It darted between their legs, leaving scratch marks on the hardwood floor. It ran back towards the fireplace, and for a moment, I thought it might go back up the chimney. Instead, it crashed into the fire screen, knocking it over and sending embers scattering across the rug. That's when things got even scarier. The rug started to smoke where the embers had landed. My grandma was screaming about the fire, while my grandpa was still focused on the raccoon. I could smell the acrid scent of burning fabric mixing with the pine and cinnamon smells from earlier. My dad ran to stamp out the smoldering spots on the rug, while my mom finally managed to scoop me up and get me out of the room. She took me to the kitchen, but I could still hear the chaos from the living room. The sounds of breaking glass, thumping furniture, and panicked yells mixed with the raccoon's screeching. From the kitchen, I could see into the living room. The Christmas tree was on its side, ornaments scattered everywhere. The presents were strewn about, some torn open by the raccoon's claws. The room that had looked so magical earlier was now a disaster zone. I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Finally, I heard my dad shout that he'd got it. There was a moment of silence, then the sound of a door slamming. When I peeked back into the living room, the raccoon was gone. My dad and grandpa had managed to trap it in a blanket and toss it outside, but the damage was done. The room looked like a tornado had hit it. Broken glass and ceramic were everywhere. The Christmas tree was a mess of bent branches and broken ornaments. The curtains hung in shreds, and the rug had several burned patches. The smell of smoke hung in the air, mixing unpleasantly with the spilled drinks and food. My grandma was crying, looking at the destroyed room. My mom was trying to comfort her, while also checking if anyone was hurt. My dad and grandpa were out of breath, their clothes disheveled and scratched up from wrestling with the raccoon. In just a few minutes, my exciting Christmas Eve, full of anticipation for Santa, had turned into something out of a nightmare. The magical fireplace that I thought would bring Santa had instead brought chaos and destruction. The adults started cleaning up, sweeping broken glass and righting overturned furniture. I wanted to help, but I was told to stay back because of all the sharp pieces everywhere. So I just sat on the stairs watching as they tried to salvage what they could of Christmas. I was 10 years old and it was Christmas Eve. Our family always went to the candlelight service at our church. It was supposed to be this beautiful, peaceful thing, you know? Everyone holding lit candles in the dark church, singing carols. I used to love it. The way the flames made everything glow, how the light danced on the walls. It felt magical. That year, I was extra excited because I got to wear my new Christmas dress. It was red velvet with a white lace collar, and I felt so grown up in it. My mom had spent ages curling my hair, which was really long back then. It fell all the way down my back in these perfect ringlets. I remember being so careful not to mess it up on the car ride to church. When we got there, the church was already packed. It smelled like pine from the big Christmas tree at the front, and a bit like the candle wax from all the candles they were handing out. We squeezed into a pew about halfway down the aisle. I ended up sitting between my mom and this older lady I didn't know. As the service started, they began dimming the lights. It got darker and darker until the only light was coming from the candles at the front of the church. Then they started passing the flame. The pastor lit his candle from the big altar candle. Then he lit the candles of the people in the front row. They turned and lit the candles of the people behind them, and so on. I was fidgeting in my seat, impatient for the flame to reach us. I watched as it got closer and closer, this little point of light being passed from person to person. When it finally got to our row, I held my candle out eagerly. The man next to my mom lit her candle, and then she turned to light mine. I remember the warmth of the flame as it caught on my candle's wick. I was so proud to be holding it, trying to keep my hand steady so the flame wouldn't flicker out. I turned to pass the flame to the lady next to me, feeling very grown up and responsible. That's when I first noticed something was off. As I turned back to face the front, I caught a whiff of something burning. It wasn't the usual candle smell. It was sharper, more acrid. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone had accidentally dripped some wax or something. But then I felt it, a warmth on the back of my neck, different from the gentle heat of the candle I was holding. It was more intense and it was spreading. I turned my head slightly, trying to see what was happening, and that's when I saw it out of the corner of my eye. A flicker of orange, much bigger than my candle flame, right behind my shoulder. For a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Then I realized my hair was on fire. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like my brain just shut down. I could feel the heat growing, spreading across the back of my head. The burning smell got stronger, filling my nose. It was the smell of my own hair on fire, but I still couldn't react. It was the lady next to me who noticed first. She let out this gasping shriek that seemed to echo through the whole church. That's when everyone around us realized what was happening. Suddenly, there was chaos. My mom screamed. I heard my dad yell my name from further down the pew. People were jumping up, knocking over their candles. Someone grabbed me from behind and I felt a heavy weight on my head and shoulders. Later, I found out it was a man using his suit jacket to smother the flames. The weight pushed me forward, and I dropped my candle. I could hear it clatter on the floor, but I couldn't see anything. My face was pressed into my mom's side, and the jacket was still over my head. Everything was muffled and dark, but I could hear people shouting, crying, praying. I don't know how long it took to put the fire out. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. When the jacket was finally pulled away, the first thing I noticed was the smell. That horrible, acrid stench of burned hair was everywhere. It seemed to cling to everything. My mom was crying, her mascara running down her cheeks. She was running her hands over my head and face, asking if I was hurt. I remember being surprised that I wasn't in pain. I could feel that my hair was different, shorter and crispy in places, but my scalp didn't hurt like I thought it would. The church was in an uproar. People were standing on the pews to see what had happened. Kids were crying. The pastor was trying to calm everyone down, but his voice was shaky. Someone was calling 911 even though I wasn't injured. I turned around to see who had been sitting behind me. It was a young couple, probably in their 20s. The woman was sobbing hysterically, repeating over and over that she was sorry. Her husband looked pale and shocked. I realized it must have been her candle that set my hair on fire. As the initial shock wore off, I started to understand what had happened. The woman's candle had dipped forward when she wasn't paying attention. My long, curled hair had been the perfect fuel. If the lady next to me hadn't noticed so quickly, if that man hadn't acted so fast with his jacket, I didn't want to think about how much worse it could have been. People started crowding around, asking if I was okay. Their faces looked weird in the candlelight, all shadows and concerned expressions. I nodded, still not really able to speak. I reached up to touch my hair and felt the damage for the first time. Where it had once fallen smoothly down my back, it now felt rough and uneven. Chunks of it came away in my hand, burned to a crisp. The pastor made his way over to us looking pale and shaken. He knelt down in front of me asking if I was all right. I nodded again. He suggested we all pray, and suddenly everyone around us was bowing their heads. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could think about was the smell of my burned hair and the feel of the crispy strands between my fingers. After the prayer, things started to calm down a bit. Someone had called the fire department and we could hear sirens in the distance. My dad was talking to the couple who had been behind us. The woman was still crying, but more quietly now. My mom hadn't let go of me since it happened, her arm tight around my shoulders. The paramedics arrived and insisted on checking me over even though I kept saying I was fine. They shined lights in my eyes and felt around my scalp. They seemed surprised that I hadn't been burned. One of them said something about how lucky I was, how it could have been so much worse. As they were examining me, I caught sight of myself in a reflection on one of their badges. I hardly recognized myself. My carefully curled hair was now a mess of singed, uneven strands. The right side, where the fire had started, was burned almost to my scalp in places. The red velvet dress I had been so proud of was smudged with soot and water from when they put out the fire. I looked like a different person. The fire chief talked to my parents for a while. He explained how quickly hair can catch fire, how we were lucky it hadn't spread to my dress or to anyone else. He said something about how candles and kids don't mix, and how the church might want to rethink their Christmas Eve service. Throughout all of this, I remained weirdly calm. It was like I was watching everything happen to someone else. I could see how upset everyone was, my parents, the couple behind us, the pastor, even the paramedics looked shaken. But I just felt numb. As things started to settle down, people began to leave. The service was obviously over, even though we had barely started the carol singing. As they filed out, people kept stopping to look at me to tell me how brave I was, how it was a Christmas miracle I wasn't hurt. I didn't feel brave or miraculous. I just felt tired and confused. My parents decided we should go home. As we walked out of the church, I could hear people whispering. Some were still crying. Kids were pointing at my hair. I kept my eyes on the ground, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. As we drove home, the car was silent except for the radio playing Christmas carols. I remember that it felt wrong, hearing those cheerful songs after what had just happened. I was 13 when it happened. My aunt and uncle had asked me to babysit my younger cousins on Christmas Eve. They were going to a party and needed someone to watch the kids. I thought it would be easy money, you know? Just hang out, watch some Christmas movies, maybe bake some cookies. I'd babysat for them before and it was always pretty chill. When I got to their house, it was already dark outside. The whole neighborhood was lit up with Christmas lights and there was a light dusting of snow on the ground. It felt like a perfect Christmas Eve. My aunt and uncle left pretty quickly after I arrived, reminding me where everything was and telling me to call if there were any problems. At first, everything was going great. My cousins were 7 and 9, old enough to be fun, but young enough to still believe in Santa. We made some hot chocolate and settled in to watch How the Grinch Stole Christmas. The house was all decorated for Christmas with a big tree in the corner of the living room and stockings hung up on the fireplace. About halfway through the movie, we heard a noise. It was faint at first, just a soft thump coming from above us. My younger cousin got all excited, saying it must be Santa on the roof. I laughed it off, telling them it was probably just the wind or something. But then we heard it again, louder this time. The kids were getting more excited now, convinced that Santa had come early. I tried to calm them down, reminding them that Santa doesn't come until everyone's asleep. But I have to admit, I was starting to feel a little uneasy. The sounds didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. We tried to go back to watching the movie, but the noises kept coming. They were getting louder and more frequent. It sounded like something heavy was moving around up there. My mind started racing, trying to think of what it could be. A raccoon, maybe? Or a branch that had fallen on the roof? The younger kids were still excited, but I could tell the older one was starting to get scared. He kept looking up at the ceiling, then at me, like he was waiting for me to explain what was happening. But I didn't know what to tell him. I was starting to get pretty freaked out myself. I decided to turn up the volume on the TV, hoping to drown out the sounds, but they just kept getting louder. Now it sounded like something was dragging across the roof, scraping and thumping. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I thought about calling my aunt and uncle, but I didn't want to seem like a scaredy cat. Plus, what if it really was nothing? I'd feel stupid for ruining their night out over some weird noises. So I tried to keep calm and distract the kids. I suggested we make some cookies, thinking maybe if we were in the kitchen we wouldn't hear the noises as much. But as soon as we got up, there was a huge bang from above, like something had fallen. The kids screamed, and I'm not gonna lie, I did too. That's when things got really crazy. We heard this loud cracking sound, and before I could even process what was happening, part of the ceiling just collapsed, right there in the living room. Chunks of drywall and insulation came raining down along with this cloud of dust that filled the air. And then, through the hole in the ceiling, something else fell. At first, in the chaos and dust, I couldn't tell what it was. But as the dust started to settle, I realized it was a person. A man had just fallen through the ceiling into my aunt and uncle's living room. The kids were screaming and crying. I was frozen in place, just staring at this man who was now lying on the floor surrounded by debris. For a second, I thought maybe he was dead. But then he groaned and started to move. As he sat up, I got a better look at him. He was middle-aged, wearing a Santa hat and a red sweater that was now covered in dust and insulation. And he reeked of alcohol. That's when I realized this wasn't some magical Christmas intruder. It was the neighbor from across the street, and he was completely wasted. The neighbor looked around, seeming confused about where he was. He kept mumbling something about trying to get into his house. I realized he must have been so drunk he climbed onto the wrong roof, thinking it was his own house. I didn't know what to do. Here I was, a 13-year-old kid, responsible for 2 younger children, with a drunk neighbor who had just crashed through the ceiling. The living room was a disaster. There was a huge hole in the ceiling, broken drywall everywhere, and the Christmas tree had been knocked over in the chaos. The kids were still crying, clinging to me and asking what was happening. I tried to calm them down, but I was pretty freaked out myself. The neighbor was now trying to stand up, stumbling around and knocking things over. He kept apologizing, but also seemed to find the whole situation funny, which just made it even more surreal. I knew I needed to call someone for help, but I was afraid to leave the kids alone with this guy, even for a minute. I tried to guide them towards the kitchen, thinking I could use the phone in there, but the neighbor started following us, still apologizing and trying to explain himself. That's when I remembered my cell phone. I had it in my pocket, but in the chaos, I'd completely forgotten about it. With shaking hands, I pulled it out and dialed 911. I tried to explain the situation to the operator, but I'm not sure how much sense I was making. How do you explain that your drunk neighbor just fell through the ceiling dressed like Santa? While I was on the phone, the neighbor had made his way to the couch and sort of collapsed onto it. He was still mumbling, but his eyes were starting to close. The kids had stopped screaming but were still crying softly, watching the neighbor with wide, terrified eyes. I didn't know how long it would take for help to arrive, so I decided to try calling my aunt and uncle. It took a few tries, The music at their party must have been loud, but I finally got through. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I know I was talking really fast, trying to explain everything that had happened. The wait for everyone to arrive felt like it took forever. I sat with the kids on the stairs, as far from the neighbor as we could get while still being able to see him. He had started snoring on the couch, which was almost funny in a really messed up way. Finally, we heard sirens. Red and blue lights started flashing through the windows. A few moments later, there was a loud knock at the door. I hesitated for a second. We'd always been taught not to open the door to strangers, makar. But then I heard a voice identifying themselves as the police. As soon as I opened the door, it was like chaos all over again. Police officers came in, followed by paramedics. They started asking me questions, checking on the kids, and trying to wake up the neighbor. I could hear more sirens outside. I guess they'd called the fire department too, probably because of the structural damage to the house. My aunt and uncle arrived just as they were loading the neighbor into an ambulance. They looked shocked, staring open-mouthed at the hole in their ceiling and the mess in their living room. I started trying to explain everything again, but I was so tired and scared that I'm not sure how much sense I was making. The police took statements from all of us. Even the kids had to answer some questions. The officers kept saying how lucky we were that no one was hurt. One of them told my aunt and uncle that if we had been sitting where the neighbor fell, things could have been much worse. I was 8 years old when it happened. My family was doing what we did every Christmas, going to the tree farm to pick out our perfect Christmas tree. It was supposed to be this fun, special day that we did together every year. The farm was huge, with rows and rows of pine trees stretching out as far as I could see. My parents were walking ahead, talking about which tree looked the best. My dad had this big saw with him, ready to cut down whatever tree we chose. The ground was covered in pine needles and everything smelled like Christmas, that sharp, fresh pine smell that always reminds me of the holidays. I remember getting bored pretty quickly. All the trees looked the same to me, and I was tired of walking around and listening to my parents discuss the perfect shape and height. I started to wander a bit, looking at the different trees. They were so tall, creating these long green corridors that seemed to go on forever. I didn't mean to get lost. It just happened so fast. One moment I was looking at a particularly interesting tree, and the next, I realized I couldn't see my parents anymore. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. Row after row of pine trees, all looking identical. At first, I wasn't really scared. I thought I'd just walk a little and find my parents. But as I kept walking, nothing looked familiar. The rows of trees seemed to stretch on forever, creating a maze that didn't make any sense. I started calling out, but my voice just seemed to get swallowed up by the trees. That's when it started to snow. At first, it was just a few light flakes, kind of pretty and magical. But then it started coming down harder. The snowflakes got bigger, and they were falling faster. The ground was getting covered, and the trees were becoming harder to see clearly. I realized I was getting cold. My jacket wasn't that thick, and the snow was starting to stick to my hair and eyelashes. I could feel my fingers getting numb, and my shoes were getting wet. The snow was muffling everything, making the farm feel completely silent except for the soft sound of snowflakes hitting the ground. The light started to change. It was getting darker, and the snow made everything look gray and dim. The trees that had seemed so green earlier now looked like dark shadows. I couldn't tell which way was which anymore. Every direction looked exactly the same, just endless rows of trees and falling snow. I started to panic. I was walking faster now, trying to find something familiar, but every turn I took just seemed to lead me deeper into the tree farm. The snow was getting deeper and my feet were getting tired. I was cold, really cold, and I could feel myself starting to shake. I tried to remember what my parents had told me about getting lost. Stay in one place. Don't wander, but I was scared and staying still seemed even more terrifying. What if no one found me? What if I froze out here in these endless rows of trees? The snow was coming down so hard now that I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The trees were like ghostly shapes blending into each other. I was completely disoriented with no idea which way was out. My feet were soaked, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. I started to cry, but the tears just felt cold on my cheeks. The snow was getting deeper, and I was getting more and more tired. My legs felt heavy, and I wanted to sit down, but I remembered something about not sitting down if you're lost in the cold, something about falling asleep being dangerous. The darkness was getting worse. The snow made everything look gray and dim, and I could barely see anything around me. The trees seemed to be closing in, creating a maze that I couldn't escape. I was completely alone, surrounded by nothing but snow and pine trees. I kept walking, but I was getting slower. The cold was making it hard to move. My fingers and toes felt like they were burning with cold, and I was shivering so hard I could barely walk straight. The snow was up to my knees now, making each step a struggle. I started to wonder if anyone was looking for me. Were my parents searching? Did they know I was lost? The thought made me cry harder, but the tears just froze on my cheeks. The snow was getting deeper, and I was getting more and more tired. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and scared. The snow muffled every sound, making the world feel completely silent except for my own panicked breaths. I kept thinking about how cold I was, how tired I was, how I just wanted to sit down and rest. But I knew I couldn't stop. If I stopped moving, I might freeze. The thought terrified me, but it kept me putting one foot in front of the other. The snow was so deep now, and the darkness was almost complete. I could barely see anything around me. I don't know how long I'd been walking. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a short time. The cold was making everything feel weird. My thoughts were getting fuzzy, and it was getting harder to think clearly. All I could focus on was putting one foot in front of the other. Then I heard something. At first I thought I was imagining it, but no. There was definitely a sound. Voices. Calling. My name? I wasn't sure. But it was something. Something other than the silent, snowy world I'd been lost in. I tried to yell back, but my voice was weak. The cold had made it hard to make any sound. But I kept walking towards the voices, hoping they were real, hoping they were looking for me, hoping I wasn't going to be lost in this endless, snowy tree farm forever. The voices got louder. Lights started to appear through the trees, flashlights cutting through the snow. I could hear people calling my name now, definitely my name. I tried to wave, to call out, but I was so tired, so cold. And then suddenly, they were there. Faces appearing through the snow, hands reaching out to grab me, voices asking if I was okay. I remember someone picking me up, wrapping me in something warm, but everything was starting to get fuzzy. The last thing I remember was being carried out of the tree farm. I was 9 years old when it happened. Our elementary school was doing its annual Christmas play, and I had been cast as one of the elves. It wasn't a big role, but for a third grader, it felt like everything. We'd been practicing for weeks, rehearsing every single movement, every single line. The excitement had been building up since November, when our drama teacher first announced the performance. The costume was something special. My mom had helped me make it. A bright green outfit with red trim, complete with these little jingle bells that were supposed to make a soft tinkling sound when I moved. She'd spent hours sewing it, making sure every detail was perfect. I remember trying it on at home, spinning around in our living room, feeling like the most important elf in the world. Our school took these Christmas performances seriously. It wasn't just a simple play, it was an event. Parents would take time off work, grandparents would travel from out of town, and the entire school would gather in the auditorium. The stage would be transformed into this magical Christmas scene with handmade decorations, twinkling lights, and carefully crafted backdrops. The day of the performance, everything felt different. There was this electric excitement in the air. Kids were running around backstage, adjusting costumes, practicing their lines under their breath. The older students were helping the younger ones with their makeup and costumes. I remember feeling both nervous and excited, my stomach doing these little flips of anticipation. Backstage was chaos, but a controlled chaos. Our drama teacher was moving from kid to kid, making last-minute adjustments, giving encouragement. The auditorium was filling up. I could hear the murmur of voices, the occasional laugh. the shuffling of programs. Parents were finding their seats, setting up cameras, whispering to each other about how excited they were to see their kids perform. I was standing in the wings, waiting for my cue. The stage was set up with these wooden platforms. They were supposed to represent Santa's workshop. Our drama teacher had spent weeks designing and building them, making sure they looked perfect. What none of us knew was that one of those platforms had a loose nail sticking up, just waiting to catch on something. When the play started, everything seemed normal. The first few scenes went perfectly. The kids playing Santa's elves were moving around the stage, doing their little dance, delivering their lines with the kind of adorable enthusiasm that makes parents pull out their cameras. I was waiting for my moment, trying to remember all the movements we'd practiced. My part came about halfway through the play. I was supposed to dance across the stage, carrying a prop gift, and then do a little twirl. Simple enough. I'd practiced it 100 times during rehearsals. I knew exactly how to move, exactly where to step. Or at least, I thought I did. As I started to move, something felt different. At first, it was just a tiny sensation. Almost nothing. A slight catching feeling on my costume. I thought maybe a bell had gotten stuck or my shoe was untied. But then I felt it more distinctly. Something was pulling at my outfit. The stage lights were bright. So bright, I could see the audience, rows and rows of faces, parents, teachers, other students. Everyone was watching, and I could feel something was wrong with my costume. But I kept moving, trying to stay in character, trying to remember my steps. That's when I felt the first real tear. A small rip right at the side of my costume. For a split second, I thought maybe no one would notice. But then it got worse. The loose nail on the platform had caught my costume, and with each step, the tear was getting bigger. I should have stopped, should have done something. But I was frozen. The lights, the audience, the music playing in the background. Everything seemed to slow down and speed up at the same time, and then, suddenly my entire costume just gave way. The rip was complete, instant, total. One moment I was an elf in a carefully made costume, and the next moment I was standing there in nothing but my underwear, under these huge, bright stage lights, in front of everyone. The silence was the worst part. For a moment, everything stopped. No music, no movement, just complete, total silence. Hundreds of eyes staring directly at me. The heat of the stage lights, the feeling of absolute, total exposure. Then the sounds started. A giggle, then another, then more. It grew like a wave, this rising tide of laughter and whispers. I could hear everything. Every single sound seemed amplified. The rustling of programs, the shifting of seats, the occasional sharp laugh. I wanted to run, to disappear, to sink into the stage floor. But I was completely, totally frozen. My brain had stopped working. My body wouldn't move. I was just standing there, under these massive stage lights, wearing nothing but my underwear, with hundreds of people staring. My drama teacher was moving. I could see her in my peripheral vision starting to come towards me. Some parents were shifting in their seats, but I was stuck. Completely, totally stuck. Like those nightmares where you can't move, can't escape. Except this wasn't a dream. This was happening. Right now. To me. The stage felt endless, massive, like I was standing on this huge platform completely exposed, with every single person watching. The Christmas decorations that had seemed so magical just moments ago now felt cruel. The twinkling lights, the paper snowflakes, everything was mocking me. And then, suddenly, someone was moving towards me, trying to help, trying to cover me. But in that moment, all I could feel was the absolute total humiliation, the complete and total exposure. I remember waking up that Christmas morning feeling a bit confused. Usually, by the time I opened my eyes, the house would already be alive with activity. The smell of coffee drifting up the hallway, the muffled clanging of pots and pans in the kitchen, and the faint hum of Christmas music coming from the living room. But that morning it was quiet. Too quiet. At first I thought maybe I had just woken up earlier than usual. But the silence felt strange, almost unnatural. The air in my room felt colder than it should have been. I thought about pulling the blankets back over myself and waiting for someone to come wake me up, but something about the quiet tugged at me. It wasn't just an absence of noise. It felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. Still groggy, I swung my feet off the bed and stood up, rubbing my arms to shake off the chill. I didn't know then what I was walking into. I stepped into the hallway expecting to see the glow of Christmas tree lights spilling into the dim corridor. But everything was dark. The tree was off. The usual decorations seemed duller somehow, and even the daylight that filtered through the windows looked muted, like it had lost some of its warmth. I called out for my parents, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. Nothing. No response. Just the faint creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I walked toward their bedroom, the quiet wrapping itself tighter around me with each step. The door was ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of the bed inside. I pushed it open all the way. They were there, lying in bed. But something was off. They looked too still. My mom was always a light sleeper, and she would stir the moment someone entered the room. But this time, she didn't move. My dad was on his side, facing the wall, completely motionless. I froze in the doorway, a growing unease twisting in my stomach. I stepped closer, calling out again. No answer. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet room, echoing slightly in a way that made me shiver. My mom's face was pale, her lips slightly parted. I reached out and touched her shoulder, expecting her to stir, to blink groggily and tell me I was imagining things. Her skin was cool. Not freezing, but not the warmth you'd expect from someone bundled under blankets. A wave of panic hit me. I shook her shoulder gently at first, then harder. She didn't move. My dad, lying just a few feet away, was the same. I tried shaking him too, my hands trembling as I gripped his arm. Nothing. My chest tightened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Something was very wrong. My breath came in shallow gasps and I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. My first instinct was to get help. I ran out of the room, my footsteps pounding against the hardwood floors. The kitchen. The phone was in the kitchen. When I reached it, my hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the receiver. I punched in 911, the buttons blurring in my vision, and pressed the phone to my ear. A calm voice on the other end asked me what was wrong, and I tried to explain. My words came out in a jumbled rush, something about my parents, about them not waking up. The operator's voice was steady, asking me questions, telling me to stay on the line. I clung to the phone like it was a lifeline. The minutes that followed felt like hours. The house, so silent before, now felt oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around me, the weight of the stillness pressing down harder with every passing second. I couldn't bring myself to go back to my parents' room. Instead, I sat in the kitchen, my knees drawn to my chest, staring at the clock on the wall and willing the sirens to come faster. Every creak of the house made my heart jump. I half expected to hear footsteps in the hallway, to see my mom or dad shuffle into the kitchen, irritated at being woken up. But no one came. When I finally heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance, it was like a dam breaking. Relief and dread surged through me all at once. The flashing lights painted the walls in eerie red and blue as the ambulance pulled up in front of the house. 2 paramedics burst through the door, their movements brisk and efficient. I pointed them to my parents' room, unable to form coherent words. They disappeared down the hallway, leaving me alone again in the suffocating quiet. I listened to the muffled sounds of them working in the other room, the occasional murmur of voices reaching me. Then one of them returned, kneeling down to speak to me. He asked if we had a gas heater in the house. I nodded, my thoughts scrambling to piece together what he was saying. Carbon monoxide, he explained. A faulty heater, odorless, invisible, deadly. The words hung in the air like a thick fog. My parents had been breathing it in all night. The paramedic said it was lucky I'd woken up when I did, if I'd stayed asleep much longer. He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. I watched as they carried my parents out on stretchers, oxygen masks strapped to their faces. They looked so fragile, so small beneath the bulk of the blankets. The cold air hit me as soon as I stepped outside, sharp and biting. And for a moment I just stood there staring at the ambulance. The lights flashed against the snow-covered lawn, casting long, distorted shadows. Neighbors began to peek out of their windows, drawn by the commotion, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. I felt too numb, too disconnected from everything around me. The paramedics loaded my parents into the ambulance and I followed them to the hospital in a separate vehicle. The drive was a blur. When we arrived, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit me immediately, sharp and unpleasant. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold, unnatural glow over everything. A nurse led me to a waiting area, where I sat, staring at the tiled floor. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Minutes felt like hours. I couldn't stop replaying the morning in my head. The silence, the stillness, the moment I touched my mom's shoulder and realized something was horribly wrong. When they finally let me see my parents, they were hooked up to machines, oxygen masks still covering their faces. They were alive, but they looked so fragile, their skin pale and their breaths shallow. It didn't feel real. It was like looking at strangers. I stood there unsure of what to do, before someone gently guided me out of the room. That's where it ends. The day that started with the promise of Christmas morning ended in a hospital, surrounded by the hum of machines and the sterile smell of disinfectant. I can't explain the feeling of standing in that house surrounded by silence, knowing how close we all came to not waking up at all. It's something I'll never forget. I was 6 years old the Christmas it happened. Back then, Christmas Eve was magical in a way that only a child can truly understand. Our little house felt alive with the holiday spirit. The air smelled like pine from the real tree in the living room and sweet sugar cookies cooling on the counter. My parents had pulled out the old vinyl records, and the sound of classic Christmas songs crackled through the house. My older brother and I had spent most of the day decorating the tree. He was patient enough to let me take the lead, though I could barely reach the lower branches. Ornaments ended up clustered in awkward spots, but my parents never moved them, insisting that it was perfect as it was. It made me feel special, like I had made Christmas happen. It felt safe, like nothing bad could ever happen in our brightly lit home. The world outside seemed far away, cold and distant, while inside, it was warm and glowing. That feeling of safety made it all the worse when things took a turn. It started innocently enough. My brother, who was 8 at the time, decided he needed to tell me about Krampus. He explained it in the way older siblings do, with a casual tone that made it all the more believable. Krampus isn't like Santa, he said. If you've been bad, Krampus comes for you instead. He's big, with leathery skin, long horns, and sharp claws. He doesn't give you coal. He takes you away in his sack. I tried to laugh it off, but he wasn't done. He leaned in, lowering his voice like he was sharing a terrible secret. Sometimes you can hear him scratching at the windows, and if you're really bad, you'll hear his chains dragging across the floor before he comes for you. I wanted to believe it was just a story, but the way he said it stuck in my head. His calm, matter-of-fact delivery made it worse. He didn't sound like he was trying to scare me. He sounded like he was warning me. That night, after all the excitement of the day, we were sent to bed early. My parents said we needed to sleep so Santa could come. I didn't argue, but as I climbed into bed, my brother's words kept echoing in my mind. I hadn't thought I'd been bad that year, but the seed of doubt was there now. What if Krampus thought differently? Our room was small, with twin beds on opposite sides. My brother fell asleep almost immediately, his soft snores filling the room. I lay there staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the unease that had settled over me. The room seemed darker than usual, the shadows stretching longer across the walls. Every creak of the house settling and every faint rustle of the wind outside felt amplified, as if the whole world had gone silent just to let those noises through. I told myself it was just a story. Krampus wasn't real. But the more I tried not to think about it, the more vivid the image in my mind became. I could see him, tall and hunched with curling horns and glowing eyes. I started imagining what I'd do if I heard scratching at the window or the sound of chains. Would I scream? Would anyone come to help me? My heart raced as the thoughts spiraled. Then I heard it. A soft, steady scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the window. My stomach tightened, and I froze. For a moment, I convinced myself it was just the wind brushing against the glass, but then it came again, longer this time, like something sharp being dragged across the pane. My breath caught, and I gripped the edge of my blanket tightly. Deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. Slowly, I turned my head to look at the window. The darkness outside pressed against the glass, and at first I saw nothing. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a shadow, tall and hunched, just like I had imagined. Horns curled out from its head, and it seemed to be staring back at me. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I felt them, like they were burning into me. My whole body went stiff and tears welled up in my eyes. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't even blink. The shadow shifted slightly, and I thought I saw movement, something curling at its sides like claws or fingers. That's when I snapped. I yanked the blanket over my head, as if that thin layer of fabric could protect me. My tiny body trembled as I tried to disappear under the covers. My brother's snores continued, oblivious to my terror. I wanted to wake him, but I couldn't make myself move. The scratching continued, steady and deliberate. I clenched my eyes shut, willing it to stop, but it didn't. My mind raced through every possibility. Was it really Krampus? Had I done something bad enough to deserve this? I thought about every little thing I'd done that year, fighting with my brother, sneaking an extra cookie before dinner, lying about brushing my teeth. None of it seemed bad enough for this, but the sound at the window didn't care. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I lay there, straining to hear anything, but the room was completely still. The only sound was my own shaky breathing. The terror didn't leave, though. If anything, the silence made it worse. Was it still out there, waiting for me to peek out? Or had it moved on to another window, another child? I stayed under the blanket, too afraid to move. My mind kept conjuring images of Krampus bursting through the window or creeping into the room. I'm not sure how long I stayed like that, but eventually, exhaustion took over. My body gave in, and I drifted into a restless sleep, still clutching the blanket like a lifeline. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the window. For a moment I felt relief, thinking it had all been a bad dream. But then I sat up and looked around. The curtain by the window was slightly torn, a thin strip of fabric hanging loose where it had been perfectly intact the day before. My stomach dropped as I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of it. I forced myself to look outside. The snow-covered yard was peaceful, undisturbed except for a small branch lying near the window. I noticed the way the shadow of the tree lined up perfectly with the window frame. The horns I had seen must have been the bare branches swaying in the wind, and those glowing eyes, probably just the reflection of car headlights passing by on the street. But even with those logical explanations, the memory of the scratching sound wouldn't leave me. My brother woke up not long after, completely unaware of the terror I had endured. He teased me for looking pale and groggy, but I didn't tell him why. I didn't tell anyone. I was too embarrassed. But more than that, I didn't want to say it out loud and risk making it feel real all over again. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a blur of presents, laughter, and holiday cheer. But in the back of my mind, the memory lingered. Even now, I can still hear that scratching sound if I think about it too hard. And sometimes, when the wind brushes against my window at night, I feel that same chill, wondering if it's really just the wind after all. Você está absolutamente certo, e eu deveria ter atendido ao requisito de no mínimo 7.000 caracteres. Isso foi erro da minha parte, e agradeço por apontá-lo. Vou corrigir isso agora e desenvolver o relato completo com o nível de detalhe, progressão lógica e o mínimo de 7.000 caracteres que você pediu. Vou recomeçar e entregar o texto completo imediatamente. At 14, I felt invincible. I wasn't a daredevil, but I liked proving I could handle things, especially when it came to helping around the house. That Christmas, I volunteered to handle the roof lights. My dad usually did it, but I wanted to show him I could take on more responsibility. Our house wasn't anything extravagant, just a modest 2-story place in a quiet neighborhood. But during the holidays, it transformed into a beacon of Christmas cheer, with strings of lights framing every edge, candy cane decorations lining the walkway, and a glowing Santa sleigh on the lawn. That morning was crisp, with a thin layer of snow covering everything from the night before. The sky was clear, the kind of blue that almost tricks you into thinking it's warmer than it is. I bundled up in my thickest coat, gloves, and boots, ready to take on the task. My dad helped me set up the ladder against the side of the house. It was an old metal ladder that had been with us for years, dented but reliable. Or so we thought. Climbing the ladder wasn't new to me. I'd done it before to help clean the gutters or hand my dad tools when he was working up high. But that day something felt different. Maybe it was the snow making the rungs feel slick, or the way the ladder wobbled slightly as I stepped onto it. I chalked it up to nerves and kept going, determined not to back out. Once I reached the roof, I took a deep breath and steadied myself. From up there, the world felt smaller. The yard, the street, even the neighboring houses seemed so far below. I started securing the lights, carefully placing the clips along the edge of the shingles. The snow made the surface slippery, but I moved slowly, testing each step before putting my weight on it. My family was below, busy with other decorations. My mom was arranging the porch garland and my dad was untangling another set of lights. I could hear their voices faintly, along with the crunch of snow as they moved around. About halfway through, I heard a faint scraping sound. I paused, looking around, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I glanced down and noticed the ladder had shifted slightly. It wasn't leaning perfectly against the house anymore. It had tilted just enough to make me uneasy. I called out to my dad, but he didn't hear me over the noise. I tried to ignore it and focused on finishing the lights, telling myself I could fix the ladder once I climbed down. But the longer I stayed up there, the more anxious I became. The snow under my boots felt like it was melting, making the roof even slicker. I leaned forward to secure the last section of lights when the ladder gave way completely. I froze as I watched it fall, landing with a loud crash in the yard. My dad spun around, his face a mix of confusion and alarm. I was stuck. There was no way to get down. I edged toward the side of the roof, hoping to climb down onto the porch. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking as I gripped the edge of the shingles. The porch roof wasn't far below, just a few feet, but the snow made every movement feel dangerous. I lowered one foot carefully, testing the surface, when my boot slipped. Before I could catch myself, I lost my balance and fell. The fall wasn't long, but it felt like an eternity. I landed hard on something sharp and the impact knocked the wind out of me. For a moment I couldn't move. My brain couldn't process what had just happened. Then the pain hit, sharp, searing, and all-consuming. I looked down and saw that I was impaled on our iron fence. One of the decorative spikes had gone straight through my thigh, pinning me in place. I screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was raw, guttural, the kind of sound that only comes from pure agony. Blood poured from my leg, soaking through my jeans and dripping onto the snow below. The contrast of red on white was almost surreal, like something out of a nightmare. My family rushed toward me, their faces pale with shock. My dad tried to lift me off the fence, but the pain was unbearable. Every slight movement felt like my leg was being torn apart. Neighbors started gathering, their voices a distant hum as they called for help. Someone must have dialed 911, but I wasn't aware of much beyond the pain. I could feel the cold metal of the fence pressing against my skin, the wetness of the blood, and the sharp sting of the icy air. Time seemed to stretch, every second dragging on as I hung there, helpless. The paramedics arrived faster than I expected, but the wait felt like a lifetime. They worked quickly, but every touch sent fresh waves of pain through my body. I remember one of them saying something about stabilizing me, but their voices blurred together. I caught glimpses of their tools, the straps they used to secure me, and the way they avoided looking directly at the wound. As they lifted me off the fence, I felt a sickening pull in my leg. The world spun, and I thought I might pass out. I stared up at the sky, the gray clouds swirling above, and tried to focus on my breathing. The lights on the roof were still blinking, casting their red and green glow over the snow. It felt wrong, like the holiday cheer was mocking what had just happened. They loaded me into the ambulance, and I remember the sound of the siren as it faded into the background. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was my mom's face, pale and tear-streaked, as she watched from the driveway. The Christmas lights kept blinking behind her, steady and unbothered as if nothing had happened. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow, and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to